Hello and welcome to my talk on human aggression. And thank you to Enzo and the Therapy Route for hosting this. I am going to share my screen. Right. So I'm going to be covering a lot of ground in this talk to do with psychoanalysis, neuroscience, and the contribution these various perspectives make to unlocking the strange paradoxical nature of human aggression. So I'll be covering a lot of ground and a tapestry of different concepts to put across the complex and paradoxical nature of this condition, this human condition. But I want to start with a very simple observation, which is based on someone I know who's actually an attorney, very well steeped in adversarial discourse. And he's also an avid comic book collector. And he made a comment that unlike in the comic books, where the villains take great pride in being the villains, in real life, no one sees themselves as the villains in their story. And it seemed to apply to the Hitlers of the world, not the Putins of the world, not the serial killers, and not you or I in our everyday relationships. And this very simple observation struck me more and more as I thought about it. It's actually very profound, that internal to every perpetrator is the perception of victimhood or injury. And this is something I'll explore a bit further in the paper, in this talk. I'll start with some examples of this condition, this phenomenon, starting with the fictitious Frankenstein's monster, where he says, inflamed by pain, I vowed eternal hatred and vengeance to all mankind, not just the father who created him and abused him, but to all mankind. But he talks about his revenge, a deep and deadly revenge, such as would compensate for the outrages and the anguish I had endured. In other words, he was going to commit violence in reaction to his injuries. But how about some real life examples? And this is taken from Richard Wood, who recently published a book on malignant narcissism. And what's interesting about it is that he's a psychologist who writes about his own experience of having a father who was a malignant narcissist. So he says of himself as a kid, his insides largely felt like a wasteland, devastated, with rage born of cruelty, exquisite vulnerability, and helplessness. That's his own experience, his rage coming from victimhood. But he also says of his father, who was the perpetrator, that in his rages, in his malignancy, he would sound like a small and defenseless child in great pain. A child who expected, no, he says, demanded that others heed his cry. So these are interesting real life examples. But what about geopolitical examples? Let's look more broadly at Hitler's speech, the arch villain of human history, where he talks to his people in 1942 in his so-called Stalingrad speech about how the West have destroyed and grabbed, taken possession using brute force, and that they have oppressed and yoked and subject people, and that Germany's war was a struggle for the preservation of Germany. And I stress preservation. In other words, in his mind, he's saying it's a war in defense of. How about Putin in his more recent speech to his people in 2022, justifying the invasion of Ukraine, where he talks about how the West and the US had practically put the squeeze on us, he says, finish us off, utterly destroy us, justifying acts of perpetrating violence. And incidentally, these are not isolated examples. These are all over the place. Or I'd be remiss in not including South Africa's history. P.W. Botha, the crocodile, quite genuinely, I think, in his infamous 1985 Rubicon speech, talking about how the ANC and its forces at the time were trying to destroy South Africa, and that if it was allowed, white South Africa, he said, and other minority groups would be on a road to abdication and suicide. And that the struggle forces were trying to destroy through violent and brutal means. We see these examples all over history. Freud makes the point that neurotic acts of revenge often originate in hurt from those closest, but can be directed at the wrong people. In other words, he says that punishment must be exacted, even if it does not fall upon the guilty. And this is a phenomenon we see all over the place. So let's get into a bit of the theory about why this should be the case. Well, in a letter to, and this is a well-known thing, but I'll just give you two examples of it. In a letter to a colleague in 1907, Freud wrote that he came to regard the psychosexual constitution and certain knock-shy of sexual life, as he put it, as the most important causes of neurotic disorders that are so common. He also commented that better insight shows that the essence of all illness, in a sense, all neuroses, lies solely in a disturbance of the organism's sexual processes. So this held sway in his thinking. But then in 1920, he brings forth his work beyond the pleasure principle, but he's very reticent about it because he sees it as quite meta-theoretical, speculative, borrowing from science and biology. And he's a little tongue-in-cheek, perhaps apologetic, about this little work that he worries will discredit him in the eyes of his colleague. And yet this little work, which I'll rely on in this talk, comes to represent one of the most significant shifts in the history of the mind and of neuroscience in general, which I believe corroborates a lot of his thinking. And where it leads to, and to put the cart before the horse, a conclusion which I'm just going to, in a way, flag ahead of time, spoiler alert, is that focusing in treatment on the libidinal only, which was Freud's earlier emphasis, becomes, as the Irish literary critic said of the famous play Waiting for Godot, a theoretical impossibility, a play in which nothing happens and yet keeps audiences glued to their seats. And this can be one of the downsides of focusing on the libidinal life drive needs in our therapy and analyses. But at the same time, paradigms are sticky masters. Very few people have heard of Georges Henry Joseph Edouard Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, interesting character, physicist, priest, who in fact was the one who proposed the Big Bang Theory, calling it the hypothesis of the primeval atom. And he presented his theory to Albert Einstein to suggest that the universe was in fact expanding, was not constant as everybody believed, including Einstein, who had introduced the fudge factor into his equations to try and keep the universe static rather than expanding. And Einstein commented to Lemaitre, "Your calculations are correct, but your physics is atrocious." And for 5 years dismissed the observations based on Einstein's own observations and physics and equations. Or let me give you a different example. A very well-respected astronomer, Sir John Frederick Herschel, who a few weeks after Darwin published his seminal work on the origin of species in 1859, wrote him a letter describing his theories of evolution as the law of higgledy-piggledy. So the simple point I'm making is that paradigms can be very sticky masters, including for those who make the scientific breakthroughs. And Freud, in some ways, fell foul of the same problem. But let me say more about his work. His dual drive theory introduces us to the life and the death drives, everyone knows. And he conceded that the meta-theoretical observations still require a lot of biology and science in time to verify or refute. Remember, Freud was a neurologist who leaned into science and biology, and was very happy if the evidence refuted or confirmed his work. But he said prophetically that in time, the sciences would give us the evidence we needed to either validate or refute his work on beyond the pleasure principle and his concepts of the death drive. And I believe neuroscience has done that. and gives us those tools. But I should say that, as Valdre noted recently in a book of hers, that few other concepts in psychoanalysis have caused such a stir, she says, and perhaps none have constituted such a breakthrough as the so-called watershed of 1920, which changes not only psychoanalytic theory, but the way we conceive humankind. And remember, Freud located it in evolution and biology. Before her, Mills also commented that although a lot of contemporary psychoanalysts tend to view the death drive as fanciful nonsense or an artifact of imagination, that he regarded it, as do I, one of Freud's most significant and greatest theoretical contributions to understanding the dynamics of the mind and of the human condition. And I hope to bring that forward in this talk. Keeping in mind that Freud did not argue that death was the only aim of life, and there's often a misconstruing of what he meant, but rather that there was a dialectical juxtaposition between the tensions of the life and the death drive, and that these drives remained interconnected, and Mills makes that point. And Freud himself, of course, is very clear that from the very beginning, he had seen a dualistic aspect to the way the drives interrelate, but that now with the introduction of the death drive, he said that these instincts, more like these drives, I'll explain, come between the life drive and the death drive, and that's the enhancement of that modeling, rather than between the life drive and the self-preservative drive, we actually see two dialectical drives in tension with each other. And that the transformation, he makes the point, that we see in the mind occurs on behalf of the pleasure principle. And I want to just suggest that wherever we talk about the pleasure principle, we're not talking about hedonism or the seeking of pleasure. We're really talking about, in modern neuroscientific terms, homeostasis. In other words, whether we move towards or away from the experience of pleasure or unpleasure, simply because pleasure or unpleasure signals whether we're moving away from or towards our viable bounds homeostatically. And so just keep in mind, when we talk about the pleasure principle, we're not talking about sitting on a beach sipping cocktails. We're talking about movement to and from homeostasis. Also want to add that Freud made the point that a lot of life drive needs, not just sexual needs, but life drive needs are themselves breakers of the peace. They constantly create tensions, produce tensions, which signal the meeting of need, of the need to meet needs. And so, in a sense, these are felt, they're proprioceptive, whereas the death drive, for reasons I'll explain as we go along, tends to want to operate in a latent state, in the background, and will remain latent and almost invisible to us unless it's mobilized. And it's mobilized when frustration, as I'll explain, and free energy starts increasing, needs are not being met. We need a mechanism to bind and manage that excess. And as a thought for later, this has implications for intervention and a passive versus active approach to our interventions. To add to this point, Wood makes a very interesting observation that love itself is an unbearable threat. He talks about to the narcissist, posing intense fear that it can arouse in people, because love and connection becomes a threat to someone who has malignant narcissism and the injuries that go with it. But I also want to suggest this is not a unique problem to malignant narcissism, but actually I ask the question, are any of us really exempt from this? Human aggression, unlike animal aggression, in other words, is different. And Eisler, who was sort of contemporary or younger than Freud, here you can see him in the picture talking to Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, makes a very poetic point that in the animal kingdom, aggression is much more self-preservative, meaning that, as he puts it, the lion and the prey are able to mingle peacefully, he says, together so long as the lion is satiated. But with the first signs of the lion's need for food, however, its prospective victims disperse in a hurry. In other words, aggression in the animal kingdom is about preservation. But in humans, it's not. It's not only that. It's about the perception of injury, the perception of disequilibrium. And I just put this picture in tongue-in-cheek because, you know, who's the aggressor and who's the victim in this picture? On the face of it, it looks like Etzebeth is the aggressor. But he's only aggressing because he has a perception that he has been injured by the Australian player. And his aggressive outburst is in response to his perception of having been injured. So let me say a bit more about the death drive. There's a misnomer that we seek death. There's a death wish in the human condition. And it's not technically an accurate depiction of Freud's concept, because really what Freud's saying is that the inanimate, and it seems quite paradoxical, the inanimate precedes the animate. Perfect quiescence, nirvana even, precedes the advent of life drive and its needs. And so we could say that with the advent of life, there is a circuitous path towards a natural end. And that's what he means by, and why he calls it the death drive. And it's led to a lot of confusion, because the death drive really is not about death, but about conservation and preservation. And so in a sense, Freud points out that the death drive is ultimately what he calls the first drive, because it predates life. And although it appears to be a logical contradiction, we can see that quiescence precedes the animation of life and its disruptive elements, which is also why there is the repetition compulsion in life in general to go back to that quiescent, inanimate, organic state. And we see this in the mental apparatus too, that there's a repetition to go back using memory, which is something I'll come back to a little bit later. Okay, so where does it all begin? Well, and I use theological motifs in this talk, not as any religious plug, but really just they're useful leitmotifs of the human condition. And Genesis, and the genesis of, so in the beginning, God creates. In other words, that for the first time, science and theology come to an agreement, there was a beginning. Up until Einstein, the idea was that the universe was eternal and constant. And suddenly we discover that there was a beginning. And from this cosmic beginning, which Einstein describes in his theories of the expanding universe, we see two fundamental forces or drives pitting against each other. Self-organizing, where systems energetically want to coalesce into self-organizing systems from atoms to galaxies, versus diffusion and entropy, where these things want to diffuse and come apart. Billions of years later, with the advent of biological life, and we see Darwin's description of variation, i.e. evolution, epigenetic variation, as we would think about it now, versus conservation of identity. In other words, that for 2 billion years, the biologists tell us, in fact, life didn't evolve very much. And it was only with the pressure of changing conditions that variation and evolution was compelled to make changes, but balanced against maintaining and conserving self-identity. And then with Freud, let's say we get into psychological life of the mental apparatus, where these same dualities are in play. The libidinal, which we can associate with variation, life drive forces to persist, versus the death drive, which is not really about seeking death so much as it is about conservation of identity and conservation of preservation of the self in whatever form that is. And so we see a trajectory all the way from cosmic evolution to the birth of the cosmos, birth of biology, and the birth of the newborn infant, the human infant, which is what we're interested in, which leads to the first cry. And I want to make the point that the first cry of the human infant is not driven, or the first act of the human infant after birth is not one of bonding and love and all these good things we associate with it, but actually the first cry is driven by the aggressive drive, meaning the infant has gone from a state of perfect balance and homeostasis into a state of disequilibrium, disruption. And the first cry is its way of throwing a punch at the environment to induce, I use that word deliberately, induce, force a response to restore homeostasis. And so the first cry, in fact, is driven by an aggressive element, an aggressive energy linked to that first drive. And it brings to mind also, again, a theological leitmotif, is that if you think about the first homicide in human history, it's not driven by territorial conquest. It's not driven by physical threat to life and limb. It's driven by feelings. When Cain kills his brother Abel, the first recorded homicide in human history, he kills him simply because his feelings are hurt, because he feels diminished and undermined. And so it gives us an interesting idea or clue into the function of feelings, both life and death drive, in its attempts to restore balance and homeostasis, to preserve us. Is hate a four-letter word? I asked tongue-in-cheek. Well, the poet Maya Angelou suggests that hate has caused a lot of problems in the world, but not has solved any. Or our beloved Nelson Mandela, who said, no one is born hating another person. People must learn to hate. For love, he says, comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Lovely sentiment we would all love to adhere to, but technically, unfortunately, not true. That hate, the aggressive drive, conservative drive, the death drive, precedes love, bonding, and attachment. Anna Freud put it quite nicely when she said that we call a good lover one who's faithful to his objects, because there is a direct cathecting with those objects. And in contrast, the good hater, think of malignant narcissism, but it applies to all of us, is promiscuous. The good hater, she says, rather poetically, I think, is promiscuous. In other words, there is free aggression that becomes encoded in the psyche and the unconscious. And that free aggression is promiscuous in that it'll attach itself to all sorts of objects in the world when there is an experience by association of some sort of provocation or injury, even if it's a stranger. So we could say then that the aim of aggression actually on this drive is really benign, even when the effects of the aggressive drive can be malignant and hurt others. Its intent, its aim actually is simply preservation, conservation against injury. And so it leads me to a point which I want to make, and I think it's quite important. We can think of aggression being to the mind what the immune system is to the body. In other words, the immune system of the body does not look for the fight. It's in a latent state. As we sit here, we have no consciousness of it. But if I inject you with E. coli and mobilize that immune system of the body, it becomes merciless, violent, cruel, microscopically, of course, in annihilating the intruders. But its aim is really benign and latent. It just wants to preserve the body. And aggression is to the mind in a similar way, that it does actually technically seek the fight. It responds by association to simply get us back to a quiescent state, to preserve us. And that's the paradox of the drive. But what's it preserving? Well, of course, it's preserving our perceived self. And this is very important. There's a subjective component to this perception. What we could say, as Solon does, that narcissism and its preservation through the aggressive drive is one of the most key features of what he also calls the immune system of our familiar sense of self, of the psyche. And he argues that the death drive for Freud was in the service of restoration and reinstating our sense of self in the world. One in which, and I put in bold, aims to restore quiescence when internal equilibrium is disturbed. Again, the aggression doesn't technically seek the fight, that immune system of the mind. It responds to perceptions of injury, to perceptions of disruption and disequilibrium. So this brings us on, I borrowed these diagrams from Mark Solmes's work, to the psychology and the physics of what I call emergent homeostasis, because it's driven by perception. You have to feel something through your own experience and memory and subjectivity to register it and act on it. But that we move, in Freudian terms, towards and away from it, pleasure and unpleasure, or to put it slightly differently in neuroscientific terms, when there is disruption, to our system, to homeostasis, it generates a demand for work. In other words, the mind has to then do something to get us back into a state of homeostasis, whether it's to find water to drink, to find a partner to have sex with. Homeostasis, in a way, then creates work for the mind. And this is the notion of homeostasis and how it links to these other components, which I'm going to elaborate on. But it also connects in modern neuroscience to Friston's free energy principle, one of the most cited neuroscientists in the world, and the concept of the Markov blanket. And I just borrow these illustrations for illustrative purposes. I don't hope to explain them, which is that when we are moving away from homeostatic bounds, viable bounds for us, not only as our bodies, but our minds, how we perceive things, we move towards entropy. We move towards an increase in free energy and entropy, which is the opposite of our Markov blanket, which is our defining sense of who we are in ourselves. To put it differently, and the ink blot is a useful illustration of this, because the ink blot, the moment it diffuses into water, it stops being an ink blot. It loses itself, its identity as an ink blot. And so the Markov blanket, which is what defines the ink blot initially, diffuses and it loses that identity. And that's the opposite of homeostasis. That's entropy or diffusion. Friston also talked about free versus bound energy, which serves that purpose, where free energy leads in the direction of entropy. But Freud had already, in a sense, dealt quite heavily with this, where he talked about psychical energy, which occurs in two forms, i.e. free or mobile, or bound and quiescent. And again, as you'll remember, what I'm saying is that the aggressive drive has the aim of restoring quiescence, not actually of looking for the fight. The life drive disrupts quiescence and homeostasis. Kirchhoff makes the point that autonomous systems are hierarchically composed of Markov blankets. It's what keeps us alive, all the way down to individual cells, all the way up to you and me. And so, in a sense, systems must self-organize to form an identity that defines it as separate from the other in order to facilitate survival. Soames puts it a bit more poetically. I love his quotes on this, where he says, the basic fabric of life is billions of little homeostats wrapped in their Markov blankets. But this is a key neuroscientific concept and a biological concept which very much links to Freud's idea of the death drive and its function in maintaining our Markov blanket mentally. So we arrive at an important point, that in human beings, feelings and affects fulfill a homeostatic function. To quote Freud, an instinct, actually a mistranslation from the German, it's really a Trieb, which means a drive, is a better interpretation, appears to us, he says, as a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection to the body. So reinforcing the point I made earlier, that Freud really says we have drives, life drives in particular, because it alerts us to deviations from homeostasis, and therefore it stimulates the demand for work in order to address needs. And feelings are very importantly fulfilling this function of homeostasis. Feelings, we could say, are homeostatic. The affects that go with that are, as Soames puts it, inherently valence perceptions. They must be qualified by specific feelings. In other words, thirst must be experienced as different from cold, as different from hunger, as different from a need to urinate. Because if we don't meet the specific needs, then we move in the direction of free energy, and with free energy in the direction of entropy. And so it has to have a quality to it, and it has to have a quantity to it. In other words, we have to feel it. It has to be registered in order to say, I am thirsty, I need water to get back into my viable bounds, and specific action is required to meet that specific need. So consciousness, which links to primitive affects, brainstem affects, tell the subject how well it is doing. And at this level of the brain, therefore, Soames points out, consciousness is closely tied to homeostasis, because I feel this about that. So what Soames' great breakthrough in his neuroscience is to really bring into the foreground that consciousness is a way of registering more primitive feelings and affects that emerge from brainstem structures and tell us when we are moving towards or away from viable bounds, biological and psychological bounds. And this is where consciousness registers ideation, the ideas we have about what feelings mean and how we can remedy them. So it helps us understand, therefore, that life drives or libidinal drives feelings to fulfill a homeostatic function. In other words, we feel needs in order to act on them to restore homeostasis. But we also have an aggressive drive, or the death drive, which has to bind free energy when meeting needs is failing. In other words, when our needs are not being met, free energy increases, particularly in infancy, which is so critical to the work a lot of us do psychologically. That free energy has to be bound in some mental way. And so when there's excess frustration in an infant, defenses fixate, to use Freud's term, as a way of binding the free energy that has come from needs not being met by the infant, even when it's inducing a response from the environment through crying. But we also notice that feelings get stored and retrieved over and over. Think the repetition compulsion. And how does this happen? Well, when we have experiences in life, those life experiences get encoded into memory in two forms. Memory we can access, but also memory that is encoded and impacts us, but cannot be directly accessed. It's non-declarative. And I'll say more about this in a minute. Eric Kandel, just to describe more about memory, won the Nobel Prize, incidentally, in science and medicine for his work on memory. And he makes the point that recorded memory is a creative process, that what it stores gets elaborated upon, reconstructed with subtractions, additions, elaborations, and distortions. In other words, that memory is, to put it in one word, subjective. And he adds to this point that explicit memory makes it possible to leap across space and time. In other words, Freud's point that the unconscious is timeless, to conjure up events that have long vanished in conscious memory in the past and yet continue to live in our minds. And so recalling memory is not like turning photographs. It's not like reminiscing. It is a creative process that is, again, in one word, deeply subjective. Soames puts it differently in his fantastic book on consciousness, The Hidden Spring. And just to make the point that Mark makes is that memory is part of feed forward. It helps us automatize to make navigation of a complex world biologically much more efficient. We can't reinvent ourselves with each new event. And we all know what happens when memory becomes impaired. It's entirely incapacitating. So what Mark points out is that this is the product of all our learning. In other words, when we have needs, we do not discover the world afresh with each new cycle. Our memory activates a set of predictions based on past experiences, again emphasizing those past experiences being encoded in memory or the unconscious through our subjective experience. And just as an aside, as the Beatles wrote, it's the love that lasts forever is the love that has no past. In other words, all our love, all our attachments get influenced for the better and the worse through our memory of early attachments. And particularly the mixed feelings we have as humans to our love objects, which I'm going to say more about. So just to remind that memory, therefore, must encode for efficient feed-forward use. It's there to feed the future, not just to remind us of the past. And so memory itself is linked to a drive that must promote towards homeostatic setting. In other words, if I'm thirsty, I know what to do efficiently to meet the need. But we also need a drive that retards or binds free energy when needs are not being met, i.e., they're being frustrated, to bring us back to some form of homeostatic settling. So we don't actually mentally fragment or move towards mental entropy. So memory therefore serves libidinal needs to efficiently minimize free energy, but also an aggressive drive that activates when free energy is increasing because needs are not being met. And that takes us back, regresses to our earlier defenses that have become fixated. So just to remind you again, but remember that memory is filtered through a subjective lens. And so in that sense, we could really say that memory actually, oddly, is narcissistic. It's not objective. But I also want to emphasize, worth remembering, is that some memories cannot be remembered, even though they are memories, but they can be enacted. Mark Kino wrote a lovely book on neuropsychoanalysis recently, talks about how memories, implicit knowledge, or what's called non-declarative memory, is not remembered, but it's enacted. It is unconscious knowledge, but not dynamically unconscious, that we cannot, even in analysis, access those memories directly as cognitive recollections. In other words, no one can remember, breastfeeding as a 3-month-old. But if there was disruption at that breastfeeding, it does get encoded and influences, impacts through non-declarative implicit memory. It will impact later behavior. But how does it do that? Through Freud's concept of regression. We revisit old reference points contained in, and again, I'm subjective memory, and that is the memories that make the building blocks of the unconscious. And so we reference old experience in a feed-forward way to current challenges and impingements in our attachments and in life's frustrations, but always, incidentally, in the interests of narcissistic preservation. From our own point of view, including the malignant narcissists, the tyrants of the world, who we all agree are tyrannical and harmful, even they perceive themselves to be responding from a place of injury. So in other words, the self-organizing entity that we all are mentally and physically is really representing our own identity, our Markov blanket. The rugby teams we support, the national identities we embrace, our genders, am I male, female, and do I identify with self versus other? And in this sense, of course, narcissism, says Freud, would not be a perversion. It's not a swear word, but it's simply the libidinal complement of self-preservation. In other words, an element of the libidinal drive that invests in the self to maintain the self. Very important component of persisting. And so in this sense, narcissism is an essential part of survival. But as Freud also says, that His Majesty the baby, that normal adults have their infantile, and I stress infantile, not all our narcissism, but our infantile narcissism effaced, but some do not. And that's where we see a lot of the regressive, malignant versions of narcissism. But I want to make the point that we all need a measure of narcissism to invest in ourselves and maintain ourselves. But here we arrive at a very key point, which I want to just stop and pause on, which is that the aggressive preservatory mechanism, that conservative mechanism, the death drive mechanism of the psyche, can become perverse. Same way libidinal drive can become perverse, separated from its original aim, like a foot fetish, where the separation of the boot, the foot, the shoe, becomes separated from the original impulse, sexual impulse in infancy. So the aggressive drive can separate from its original aim and become perverse. So in that sense, self-protective maneuvers become autonomized and are under such conditions adapted from the subject advantage of the victim at the time, and in many senses proportional to the experienced threat, i.e. think in infancy, where aversive experiences are all the baby experiences, whereas in adulthood, it's much more defined. In other words, a pinprick as an infant is their whole experience. Pinprick as an adult is partial experience. But as time passes and circumstances change, the tendency of the psyche to regress to these old points where these memories are fixated lead to maladaptive effects, despite the noble intent of the original aim. And so in that sense, the internal guardian has become perverse. And I'll just give one example of that, a defense that Freud talks about, for example, projection. We're also familiar with it, that how when there's too much unpleasure, those internal excitations of unpleasure have to be encapsulated and treated not as if they're inside us because it's too threatening, but put into the outer world so that a shield can be brought against them as a means of defense. And that's my point also about defense mechanisms operating to bind free energy in infancy, being the only mechanisms available to the infant. And this is the origin of projection, he says, plays such a key role in later pathological processes. And so we feel the repulsion of the object, we hate it. We even become aggressive towards it, even when the the origin of that hate, that aggression is in fact internal, from old automatized memories encoded because of aversive experience in infancy. And so we all have this experience with our attachments, relationships, where we have the feeling, you did this or are doing this to me, you're injuring me, you're hurting me, rather than I have encoded in my mind some associative process where when you say or do something, it's triggering an old automatized reaction. But because needs have to be met in the real world, the aggressive drive will activate when needs are being frustrated. And so hence psychical immunity is that the pathogen, as I suggest, is invariably experienced as residing outside of the self rather than inside. And just as a humorous example, this little dog looks so benign and cute, but he's the most vicious, violent, tyrannical dog you'll ever meet because he has injuries from his puppyhood that have persisted. And it reminds me of a point that Freud made, apparently in a letter to Marie Bonaparte, that dogs love their friends and bite their enemies, quite unlike people who, he said, are incapable of pure love and always have to mix love and hate. This is unique, as far as we can tell, in all species, that humans suffer the strange malady of the mind called ambivalence. We mix love and hate invariably at the same object. And it does make sense, because where we invest, where we cathect our love, is also where we then have a source of threat and injury to that love. And Freud makes the point that what he calls this remarkable phenomenon of ambivalence of feelings, love and hate, are so invariably found together in the same object. In other words, that the people we love the most, our parents, our spouses, our own children, are also the people that we will feel most injured by because of that emotional investment. They have the power to disrupt us because of that emotional investment. And it's those people then that we will also hate the most. Our babies, our parents, our spouses, the people we love the most become invariably the people we also feel the most intense hate towards. Strangers in the streets we're indifferent to. And so just to remind then everyone, when needs are not met in the outside world, where needs must be met, free energy increases, and that free energy must be bound or reduced. And so a psychical immune reaction, or a defense, if you like, rooted in infancy, must be mounted. But to remind you, Kino's earlier point, that some of those reference points, some of that memory is encoded in unconscious. It's non-recallable, it's non-declarative, it's implicit. And even though these memories permanently influence later relationships, depth and motion, or color, as he puts it, they can't be directly accessed, but they play a key and outsized role. And so what we see from the neuroscience is that implicit memory, which is driven principally by affect, because remember that in babies, the higher cognitive functions are not yet developed. So there's the mind, as it were, is still primitive. It's still driven very much by primitive mechanisms. And these affects yet play an outsized role in the formation of the mind. And so it precedes, by 2 to 3 years neurobiologically, the formation of cognition or ideation, or what Soames, I think, beautifully calls mental solids. And so we can turn René Descartes' head in that, rather than his famous thing, I think, therefore I am, it's putting the cart before the horse. We need to turn Descartes' head and suggest, actually, the neuroscience tells us that I am, therefore I think. I have experiences, I feel, and I over time develop cognition, ideation, higher mental functions, which allow us to form mental solids and make meaning of those primitive feelings and affects. And so although there are those who suggest that the past is past and cannot be changed, in fact, the neurobiological reality and the psychological reality is that the past is very present. It's held in memory, and it's constantly automatizing both on the positive and negative, the life drive and the death drive. And so we are constantly reacting in good and bad ways based on that early memory, but it hijacks us for the negative, which is really the function of therapy, is to free us from automatized reactivity in our current life that's rooted in old aversive experiences. So I hope by now, in a sense, we have largely answered the question, what exactly are psychical defenses and what are they defending against? Well, they are there to, given whatever available means are there for the infant, to bind increasing free energy when needs are not being met and frustration is increasing. And so in a sense, defenses are linked to the aggressive drive because it's a mechanism to restore, through the immune system of the mind, quiescence, homeostasis. And the forceful, violent, aggressive elements really have benign aims, which is to bind free energy and to get us back to a quiescent state. But this does have very interesting implications for treatment. And I want to remind you of a very good point that Freud makes in his Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he says, one of the striking facts of the life instincts is they have so much more contact with our internal perception, emerging as breakers of the peace and constantly producing tensions whose release is felt as pleasure. In other words, meeting needs, homeostatic needs, if you think about Soames's point. While the death instincts or the death drive, Freud points out, seems to do their work unobtrusively. In other words, that like the immune system of the body, the aggressive drive will stay in a latent state unless it perceives that there is something aversive threatening equilibrium and hence mobilizes in defense of the organism. And yet it is this death drive, this latent drive, this aggressive drive that is so central to all psychopathologies. And I want to argue, in fact, the central component. And this is where my points about Freud's paradigm shift, and he's turning his back on it. And in fact, if you look at your clinical work and your case material, you'll find invariably that it is the aggressive drive that's key in the genesis of psychopathology rather than sexuality. Sexuality is, of course, half the problem, and the life drive broadly is half the problem, but it's the other half that causes the psychopathology, the aggressive drive that gets mobilized, the defenses that get mobilized, the fixations that get automatized and reproduced in later life. These are the issues that cause all the symptoms we deal with. And so it has implications for a dual drive intervention. I want to suggest novelly a dual drive intervention, passive versus active. In other words, that we're all schooled in the idea of a more passive approach in psychotherapeutic work. In other words, we wait for material to emerge. We don't start digging it out prematurely, because if we do, we tend to provoke resistance. But if we understand the model of mind differently, that the death drive and aggression is so seminal, and key. And we also notice that because it tends to be in a dormant, latent state, that actually it very often will not emerge by itself. And so it has implications for treatment. The libidinal drive, eros, or variation in Darwinian terms, i.e. epigenetic variation, ability to adapt, is felt, it's pushed, it's manifest. We notice it. If you get thirsty, you have to be conscious of it. If you feel lonely, you have to be conscious of it. If you feel horny, you have to feel conscious of it. Otherwise, it's not a need. It's not a feeling by definition. Feeling must be felt. But the paradox of the death drive, the aggressive drive, is that it's unobtrusive, it's latent, and less mobilized. So we don't feel it. We don't feel our immune systems. We don't feel aggression until we are threatened or provoked into a state of disequilibrium. And so I want to say, only half joking there, that empathy is overrated for clinical work because it leads to collusions with what I want to call the victim within rather than the internal perpetrator. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. And it's one of the reasons I think therapy gets prolonged and often fails, is that it focuses on the empathy with the victim, the wounded part of the patient, rather than the other 50%, which is when a patient is wounded. For whatever reason, that wound will mobilize an aggressive drive in response, and it's that aggressive drive that leads to symptoms, whether it's anxiety or depression or any other symptom. And I want to quote, I love this quote from Hans Kohut, self-psychologist, who a few days before his death made this comment. He says, these idiots, they don't read what I write. They will claim that empathy cures. They will claim that one just has to be empathic with one's patients and they'll be doing fine. So I don't believe that at all. What do I believe? Well, he says that curing through love, through empathy, through kindness, through compassion, through just being there and being nice, and yes, I understand you, these things are not curative. They're essential, but they're not curative. And so what he's saying is the limitations of empathy, which fits into the more modern neuroscience that I'm bringing out, mean we have to take a much more active approach in dealing with ferreting out the death drive elements. And how do we do that? Well, we need to always consciously in our own minds as clinicians map the aggressive pathways in that patient. What are the defenses that they have brought to bear that have become automatized and stuck in that patient's life and their history? And by profiling that defensive system, we can understand the best route to intervention. But we also need to understand that all of the aggressive elements in that patient, their aims and the effects have to be differentiated, meaning that aims are benign even when the effects on their lives are malignant. And so the primacy of the aggressive drive, and I want to give some examples to just really force home this point I've been making throughout this talk. I'll take two, depression and anxiety. In depression, the key component is the introjection, the turning in from early oral fixation of the aggression to protect the love object, always or invariably hinged on loss issues. But it's the aggression against the self that is so key in leading to depression and all the symptoms we see with depression. Or take another example, anxiety. Freud made the point that anxiety is a signal state. Just like having pain or being pyrexial, having a temperature, tells us about a deeper physiological process. If you go to your GP with pain or with a temperature and you say, and he says, I'm diagnosing you with pain, or I'm diagnosing you as having a temperature, you'd walk out none the wiser, and you would walk out quite frustrated by what he's telling you because it would have no impact on treatment. The fact is that anxiety is also a signal state that telling us about a deeper problem, a deeper, usually aggressive fixation that is not being dealt with. And so until we actively look for the aggressive elements, our efficacy remains impaired in our treatment interventions. And so I want to, in conclusion, just tongue-in-cheek, remind you of Vivian Malcia, the Irish literary critic, about the Waiting for Godot play, the famous play, where he says it's a theoretical impossibility, this play, how brilliant it is. play in which nothing happens that yet keeps audiences glued to their seat. But he makes a second point. He says, what's more, since the second act is a subtly different reprise of the first, he has written a play in which nothing happens twice. And this is what I want to really argue is essentially in our intervention, is that if we remain wedded to life drive issues rather than the aggressive drive and actively seek it, map it, and ferret it out, our therapy and our efficacy remains suboptimal. So I'm going to leave it there, and obviously we can engage in further dialogue if needed. But I want to thank you for participating and giving me the time. I'm going to stop the screen share, and we can then go back to questions. And I'm going to stop recording there. So thank you very much, and I hope you got something out of that.